what do you think America should do for a comprehensive national energy policy?
Well, you know, for 27 years, I've been an environmental advocate for 27 years, and for 27 years, I've had the same answer to that question, which is free market capitalism. People say to me, what's the most important environmental law that we could pass? And I would say, I've always said the same thing. It's free market capitalism, because in a true free market promotes efficiency, and efficiency means the elimination of waste, and pollution is waste. And a true free market would encourage us to properly value our natural resources, and it is the undervaluation of those resources that causes us to use them wastefully. But in a true free market, you can't make yourself rich without making your neighbors rich and without enriching your community. But what polluters do is they make themselves rich by making everybody else poor. They raise standards of living for themselves by lowering quality of life for everybody else. And they do that by escaping the discipline of the free market. You show me a polluter, I'll show you a subsidy. I'll show you a fat cat using political clout to escape the discipline of the free market and force the public to pay his production costs. We do know this, that every nation that has decarbonized its society has experienced instantaneous wealth. Iceland in 1970 was the poorest country in Europe. It was 100% dependent on imported coal and oil. The government of Iceland, mainly because they were frightened of global warming, which impacts the northern latitudes disproportionately, decided to decarbonize their society. But again, you had vested interest in others who tried to hold back and impede that process. But the government moved very deliberately. But during that period, Iceland became 100% energy independent. 95% of Iceland's electric grid now comes from local geothermal. And Iceland went from, during that 15-year period, from being the poorest country in Europe to being the fourth richest country by GDP on Earth. Now, unfortunately for Iceland, they spent virtually all of their newfound wealth on bundled derivatives. And they are, again, the poorest country in Europe. But their economy is rebounding and will rebound because the fundamentals now are strong. Iceland is one of the world's great energy exporters. They can't run lines across the Atlantic because it's too far. They will be able to, incidentally, very soon, because Great Britain is building these great, under Gordon Brown's plan, these giant wind farms in the North Atlantic, and they're close enough to Iceland that they're going to be able to attach a DC grid line and then sell their energy directly to Europe. And they're going to be very, very wealthy. But right now, Iceland imports bauxite from Jamaica, uses the big surplus of geothermal to smelt the bauxite into aluminum, then sells the ingots on the world market, and that's their way of exporting energy. Sweden in 1996 decided to decarbonize their society and to shut down their nuclear power plants. They closed their two biggest nuke plants, slapped a $150 ton tax on carbon, and Sweden's economy since 1996 has grown by 45%, while its energy use has dropped by 9%. Brazil, 20 years ago, decarbonized its transportation grid, and as a direct result of that choice, Brazil, while the entire world economy spiraled and collapsed, Brazil continues to enjoy the longest, most robust economic expansion in the history of Latin America. I was talking to some friends tonight about the fact that Brazil this year will displace France as the fifth richest country on Earth. Costa Rica, at the same time, decarbonized their electric grid. And as a result of that choice, and Costa Rica made some other great choices too, like not having an army. And as a result of that, Costa Rica, which is the smallest country in Central America, is by far the wealthiest. Its economy is larger than most of its neighbors combined. You can go on and on with those examples. But we in our country have much greater geothermal resources than they have in Iceland. My home in Mount Kisco, New York, is powered by geothermal. Virtually every home outside of the major cities in our country could be. But almost nobody uses geothermal because of the illusion that geothermal is more expensive than the incumbents. It isn't. If you added the subsidies, it's far less expensive. But the market, the subsidies have distorted the market and sent the wrong signals to purchasers and consumers, so very few people use geothermal, which is far cheaper than oil and coal, and doesn't get us in wars in the Mideast and doesn't impose all these other costs in our society. We're the #1 in the world for wind. The Great Plains states are the Saudi Arabia of wind. We have enough wind In fact, North Dakota is the windiest place on earth at sea level. We have enough wind, according to a recent report by the Scientific American, in Montana, North Dakota, and Texas to provide 100% of the energy grid for the US and Canada 3 times over, even if every American owns an electric car. We're number 1 or 2 in the world for solar. The Scientific American report showed that we could power the entire existing US energy grid from an area of the desert Southwest that's 75 miles by 75 miles, about 19% of the most barren desert land. I've been privileged to be an advisor to the current administration, the Obama administration, on energy policy. All of the leaders of that administration, Stephen Chu, Ken Salazar, Lisa Jackson, the others, want to transition us to a new energy economy. The barriers are these, and this is the long answer to your short question. Number one, the unfair advantage that the incumbents have because of the subsidies that are flowing to them. So we're not playing on a level playing field. Obama tried to correct that first by abolishing the subsidies, the direct subsidies, like the oil depletion allowance, which is $35 to $55 billion a year, and the waiver of royalties to the oil industry, and to address the indirect subsidies through the carbon tax and to the cap and trade system, and that failed. But even with the subsidies, because of innovation, the cascading innovation that we're seeing in solar and wind, those renewables are now approaching parity with the incumbents, even with the huge advantage, unfair advantage they have in the marketplace. Number two, this is the most important, we don't have an energy grid in this country that can carry these new currents of energy. Our energy grid is antiquated, it was underbuilt, it is already overpowered, and it's misaligned. It doesn't reach the big wind centers in the Midwest, the solar centers in the desert Southwest, and it's smart, it is dumb. It's a dumb grid, and it's incapable of doing long-haul transmission of energy. Virtually every farmer in the state of North Dakota wants to put wind turbines on their property. And you have huge mountains of private capital. I'm on the board of the biggest green tech venture capital firm in the country, which is located right here in San Francisco, Vantage Point, and by far the most profitable. And in fact, they're among the top performing venture capital firms in any discipline, in any space. So they want to go into North Dakota and build wind farms. And big players like Siemens, Vestas, and General Electric, and Warren Buffett, and T. Boone Pickens all want to go there. There's huge piles of cash surrounding the state of North Dakota waiting to flow in and build turbines on every property. Every farmer in North Dakota wants to build the turbines. Why? Because a North Dakota wind farm, a North Dakota cornfield is worth $800. If it's got a wind turbine on it, it's worth $3,000. We have the ability now to, with wind, to create prosperity in declining rural economies, to create jobs, and to enrich farmers and to allow them to hold on to their farms, which is a really critical part of democracy. The problem is the North Dakota wind farmer cannot get his product to market, the electrons to market, because the electrons will diffuse in our current lines before they cross the North Dakota border. So they can't reach Cincinnati or Cleveland, Columbus, St. Louis, New Orleans, or New York. And we need to build a grid system in our country, and the Obama administration is now doing this piece by piece, a unified national grid that will connect these, the renewable power generation centers to the markets in our country. The same way that Eisenhower built a national highway system back in the 60s, we need to do that with the grid, and we need to build a smart grid. And yesterday, the headlines in many papers across the country were that Obama's going to make this one of his primary objectives between now and the election, to start implementing the smart grid in our country, and that's very, very encouraging. And the third issue, the impediment that they face, is that we have a balkanized system where we have 50 public utility commissions in the 50 states and 120 control districts, each with their own arcane and Byzantine set of rules that restrict access to the grid. What we need, what the Obama administration understands, is a unified national grid that acts as a marketplace where everybody, people like me, I produce far more energy than I use in my home. I ought to be able to sell that surplus onto the grid and make market rates for it. Today, there's very few places where you can do that. Every American ought to be able to do that. We need to create a national market where everybody can participate, one that democratizes our energy system in this country rather than one that creates oligarchies. And you know, the economic system, the political system reflects the economic system. And if you have an energy sector that's controlled by a couple of people, you ultimately are going to have a politics that is controlled by a couple of large corporations, which is not good for our country. We need to create a marketplace that does what a market is supposed to do, which is to reward efficiency, to reward good behavior, which is efficiency, and to punish bad behavior, which is inefficiency and waste. Right now, we have a marketplace that is governed by rules that were written by the incumbents, coal, oil, and nuke, to reward the dirtiest, filthiest, most poisonous, most destructive, most addictive fuels from hell, rather than the cheap, clean, green, wholesome, safe, and patriotic fuels from heaven. And we need to change that dynamic around.
So what are some, our guest today at Climate One at the Commonwealth Club is Robert F. Kennedy Jr. I'm Greg Dalton. What are some specific policies that should be implemented that would level that playing field between incumbents and clean technology?
Well, you know, it's really about, like I said, about creating a market. And when you create that unified market, national market, you turn every American into an energy entrepreneur, every home into a power plant like mine, and we can power our country then based upon American resourcefulness and entrepreneurship and what Franklin Roosevelt called American industrial genius, rather than Saudi Arabian oil. We've done this before. We built, you know, all the great infrastructure in our country was built by government. That's the role of, one of the primary roles of government. The canal system, the road system, the highway system, the railroad system, the airline system, airports were all built by the federal government, and then private entrepreneurs come and create wealth. But the infrastructure has to be built by government. So, you know, in 1979, we built an ARPANET grid in this country, which was a grid for the internet that connected every American home so everybody could participate in the internet. A year later, and I actually watched a documentary on last night on TV about this. It was very interesting about the growth of the ARPANET. But a year later, in 1980, the CEO of IBM said that PCs, personal computers, were a dead-end technology. Okay, and a lot of other computer companies made that bet, like Dell and MCR and Honeywell, and they're out of the computer business because they just bet wrong, because they didn't see what the market was going to do to revolutionize computer technology and put it and democratize it, put it in the hands of everybody. Well, today, everybody, because we built that marketplace, everybody has a PC. And what happened to the cost of information? It plummeted to almost zero. In fact, I would say zero. One of the companies, you know, that Vantage Point has is a company called Cha-Cha. Has anybody here heard of it? Raise your hand if you've heard of it. See, it's just the young people.
Yeah.
So anyway, Cha-Cha is a company that you dial on your cell phone, Cha-Cha, C-H-A-C-H-A. It's 247-247. Then you can ask any question that you want, and usually within a minute, they'll answer that question. It's free and free. They make their money by putting little advertisements while you wait. But it's free information forever. I was in China the other day, and I was showing this to some Chinese friends of mine, and I said, ask me any question. And they said, okay, what was Mao Zedong's favorite lunchtime meal? So I put it in there, and it comes back in 30 seconds, spicy brown bean soup over fried rice. Right? You can ask anything. When is he going to stop talking? When is, you know, you know, what's the meaning of life? Anything you want, and it'll try to answer it. So this is free information forever, and it happened because we built that grid. The same thing is going to happen to electrons as soon as we build a national grid for electricity. In 1996, we built a national grid for telecommunications. Bill Clinton signed the Telecommunications Act. He ordered all the baby bells to unify their lines and to lift all the restrictions so anybody could get onto the lines and sell their product. The lowest cost provider prevails in the marketplace. This spawned a telecommunications revolution in our country, and all these little gadgets that we have, like iPhones and stuff, are the offspring of that revolution. But what happened to the cost of telecommunications? Well, it plummeted to virtually zero. 2 days ago, I saw an advertisement, and these ads are ubiquitous on TV now, from a company called Vonage that promises unlimited overseas, long distance, and local calls for $14. That's practically free. Now, about 3 months ago, I called from Miami to London, and the call, for 5 minutes, the call cost me $74. That's the old way of doing things. The new way with the national grid is free telecommunications forever. The same thing is going to happen to electrons as soon as we build this national grid for electricity. Now,
how is a broke federal government going to invest this much money to build a national grid?
well, the grid itself is not going to cost that much. The grid itself, it will probably cost about $250 billion to build a smart grid that reaches most of America, and that, that can do the things that we need to do, like can send signals through the line, allow the utilities to send a signal through the line to turn off the hot water boilers in 1 million homes for 15 minutes in order to avoid the peak demand that is the most expensive part of our electrical system. If you eliminated peak, you save enough natural gas in our country to power the entire U.S. Passenger car fleet. So, and we can do that just by using the grid smartly. A grid that sends a signal to turn off all the electric toothbrush rechargers, to turn off your swimming pool recirculators, and all of these things. You don't care if somebody turns them off for 15 minutes, and you sign something. It can go into your car and borrow the stored electricity in your car, in your battery, whether you got a plug-in hybrid or a plug-in car. And so we need to build a smart grid. That costs very little. About 4 months of the Iraq War, we have a whole national grid in this country. Then to build the generation for that grid will cost about, and I can tell you this, and let me give you an example that shows you how. Right now, one of our portfolio companies it's called BrightSource. And BrightSource is building the biggest power plant in America, which is in the Mojave Desert, and it's a solar thermal plant. This is not solar voltaic of the kind that your grandmother used to bolt to her roof. This is a mirror farm in the desert where they put a turbine on top of a tower, a giant scaffold, and they surround it by concentric rings of mirrors that are manipulated by computers to reflect sunlight onto that turbine. And 20 minutes after the sun comes up in the morning, that turbine's at 750 degrees Fahrenheit. It's a very efficient way of generating energy. We're building this plant in 3 years. Well, it takes 10 years to build a coal plant. We can build this in 3 years. It costs $3 billion a gigawatt to construct. That's the same price it costs to build a coal plant. It's 1/5 the price it costs to build a nuke plant. So, and once you build our plant, it's free energy forever, because the photons are hitting the Earth for free every day. All we have to do is construct the infrastructure to pick them up and put them in the line. Once you build that coal plant, now you got to go to the Appalachians, cut down the mountains, ship them across the country on rail yards, warp every rail in this country so we can't have a high-speed rail, burn the coal, poison every fish, kill 60,000 people a year, cause 10 million asthma attacks, acidify the lakes, and all the other costs. Once you build an oil plant for the same $3 billion, and remember, ours is then free. Once you build that oil plant, now you got to go to Saudi Arabia, punch holes in the ground, bring up the oil, refine it expensively, genuflect to the sheiks who despise democracy and are hated by their own people, get in periodic wars that cost us $3 trillion, escorted across the Atlantic with a military escort that Exxon doesn't pay for, you and I do. Then you spill it all over the Gulf, spill it all over Valdez, burn the oil, and poison everybody in our country. And so the big costs occur after you build the plant. Once you build our plant, it's free energy forever.
John Wooler,
let me finish this. He's talking too much. Let me just finish to answer your question to the math. Here's the math. We use 1,000 gigawatts in peak demand in our country. 500 of those, so that's what we got to replace. 500 of those are carbon-based. So that's what we really have to replace to have free energy. The others are nuke and hydro, et cetera, that are essentially free operation at this point. So 500 at 2% growth over the 50-year life of power plant, you have to double that. But you can cut it back in half by conservation, by building codes and, and appliances, what we call negawatts, which are the cheapest form of energy. So conservatively, we have 1,000 gigawatts to replace. At $3 billion a gigawatt, which is what wind and solar cost, that is about $3 trillion, which is less than the cost of the Iraq War. So for less than the cost of the Iraq War, we can have free energy forever in this country. And then what happens? That's the biggest tax break that has ever occurred, and it's permanent, because the biggest cost to businesses and individuals in this country is our energy cost. And if you can eliminate those, which we can, then you suddenly have an advantage over the rest of the world in everything you produce, plus all the technological advantage that we get from incentivizing entrepreneurship and imagination and invention in order to construct and build this grid. And, I'll just say this final point, which is this, that in 1929, just in October, just before the stock market crash, the Dow Jones Industrial Average was at 385. In 1942, the Dow Jones was at 85. So the big stimulus package that FDR passed that we now call the New Deal kept millions of Americans alive, millions of farmers on their farms, millions of Americans in their home, thousands of banks from folding, but it was not robust enough to restore the market economy. Then in 1940, President Roosevelt gave a famous speech, one of the most important speeches in our history to our country. He went on the radio and he said, World War II is on the horizon. Remember, Pearl Harbor was still a year away, but we were doing the Lend-Lease program with England. And he said, we're going to build 50,000 aircraft a year. His aides later admitted that he had torn that number out of thin air before he sat down 5 minutes before. The year before, we had built 2,800 aircraft in our country. He said, we're going to build 50,000. He said, we're going to build 25,000 tanks. We're going to build a ship a day, a battleship a month, an aircraft carrier every 3 months. We're going to do it every month until the war is over and won. People laughed at him. He was ridiculed by editorialists on the left and the right. They said no industrial mobilization has occurred of this magnitude in history. He's bitten off more than he can chew. But Roosevelt went immediately out to Detroit. And he told the automakers, you're not building automobiles anymore. You're building aircraft, and you're building tanks and half-tracks and amphibious vehicles and bombs and detonators. Within 6 weeks, they had retooled their plants. Within 6 months, they had met his production goals. Within 12 months, they had surpassed them. The following year, we built 96,000 aircraft in this country. We had full employment. 160,000 women went to Detroit and found jobs where they'd been blackballed before with Rosie the Riveter. 200,000 blacks went to Detroit and found jobs where they'd been blackballed before. We had full employment. Everybody had cash in their pocket, and they began investing it in the marketplace again. And the market recovered, gave us a middle class, which gave us stability and prosperity for the next 50 years and made our country the envy of the world. And today, we have a huge advantage over Roosevelt, because Roosevelt was building stranded assets, planes and tanks and bombs that were being sent over to be blown up, that had no lasting benefit to the American people. Today, we have the capacity to build infrastructure, pylons that stretch across the country with wires down the existing right-of-way and railroads to bring North Dakota wind to the markets in New York, et cetera, with DC lines that don't lose the electrons. We to employ thousands of Americans erecting wind turbines on every farm in the Midwest, and millions more to bolt photovoltaics to every south and facing roof in America that wants them, and millions more to blow in cellulosic insulation to every home in America that wants those. And at the end of that, we have an infrastructure that will give us free energy forever. And then you have the entrepreneurs and the businesses take over and take advantage of this huge advantage that we now have. And that will gives us prosperity and jobs. We already have in this country, we crossed a critical milestone this year. We built in this country more wind and solar last year than we did all the generation capacity, than all the incumbents combined. And that is a critical milestone in the adaptation of disruptive technologies. The year that you build more of one than the other. So flat screen TVs 10 years ago, everybody said it'll never happen. It cost $10,000 a piece. 5 years ago, for the first time, we sold more flat screen TVs than we did vacuum tube. This year, the last vacuum tube manufacturer closed down, right? That's how fast it can happen. Once you hit that tipping point, which is the year you produce more of the one form of the energy than the other, nobody notices it because the other one is so dominant in the marketplace. Nobody notices it, but that is the milestone that you look for when the disruption, the displacement is about to take place. And we've done that in our country, and we have, this is going to happen because, not because government tells it, but because the market is going to drive it there, because we can produce cars that go, and that get 6 cents, that cost 6 cents a mile over the life of the car to drive, electric cars, versus an internal combustion engine that costs 60 cents. How long can they maintain that? It's just not going to happen. And we can produce energy for free. And so they, oil and coal and all these incumbents have a huge advantage now because they own Congress and they own the Senate. But the market ultimately is going to drive us there, and it's going to drive us there fast. We're at the tipping point now, and you're about to watch the cascade.